The film opens with a lone African-American man named Andre Hayworth, played by Lakeith Stanfield. He's wandering through a suburban neighborhood late at night, searching for his girlfriend's house. As he talks on the phone with her, he notices a mysterious car that starts following him. He is attacked by a mysterious driver wearing a Black Knight's helmet and kidnapped, leaving the scene tense and foreboding. The scene then shifts to Chris Washington, portrayed by Daniel Kaluuya, a talented 24-year-old photographer, and his girlfriend Rose, played by Allison Williams. They're preparing to visit Rose's parents' home for the weekend. Rose hasn't mentioned to her parents that Chris is black, dismissing it as no big deal. Start a road journey from Chris' downtown residence. In this lighthearted and amusing scenario, TSA agent Rod Williams is on the phone with his buddy Chris, mocking him about his relationship with Rose. Still, he's falling in love with Rose and decides to meet her parents. In this stressful and worrisome moment, a deer runs into Chris and Rose's car, inflicting damage. While Chris looks in the woods for the wounded deer, cops come and investigate the event. When Officer Ryan asks Chris for his identification, Rose becomes defensive. From the moment Chris and Rose arrive at her parents' house, things feel off. Dean, played by Bradley Whitford, and Missy, portrayed by Catherine Keener, seem friendly. Home is surrounded by rich forests. Dean expressed worry about the environmental consequences of their car collision with a deer. Meanwhile, Dean gives Chris a tour of the residence, showing him photos of Rose's family and telling him anecdotes about its past. Dean and Chris take a tour of the Armitage house, beginning in the kitchen, where they meet Georgina, the housekeeper. They talk about the racial dynamics of having black workers. Moving to the backyard, Dean talks his political ideas with Chris while admiring the seclusion and beauty of the setting. Dean, Missy, Chris, and Rose sit and talk over cold beverages. Chris and Rose confess to being in love, and Dean questions Chris about his parents, finding that his mother died in a hit-and-run accident when he was 11 years old. Georgina, an anxious server, refills their drinks as Jeremy, Missy's son, gets home and meets the guests. The tone is cheerful and inviting, with a tinge of melancholy when Chris speaks of his mother's death, and small problems occur as an effect of Chris spots with Georgina's behaviors takes place at night in the Armitage dining room, where everyone gets together after a meal. Everyone in the group laughs at Jeremy's story about Rose's collection of toenails except Rose. Jeremy, who is drunk, tells a gross story about Rose's crush on Connor Garfield in high school. The newbie, Chris, tries to stay out of arguments, while Dean keeps the talk light and works as a mediator. When Jeremy tries to choke Chris, Dean steps in and tells him to stop. Jeremy's behavior gets worse, but there's an unsettling intensity about them, and Chris begins to sense that something is very wrong behind those closed doors. Chris and Rose have a quiet time in her bedroom with her family. They talk about how her family's conduct toward him has been difficult, with her father being excessively cordial and her mother being disrespectful to his ex-girlfriend. Chris, unable to sleep, walks outside to smoke and is startled by the groundskeeper Walter, and then by Georgina. Missy then approaches him and invites him inside her office for a conversation, changing the tone of the setting from tense to casual. Missy and Chris talk in her office at night while Missy makes tea. They talk about having trouble sleeping, and Missy brings up the idea of heightened suggestibility. Missy asks Chris about his connection with his mother, which makes Chris think of his mother's death while it's raining. Chris's doubts and Missy's authoritative tone give way to trust and closeness. In a tense and worrisome moment, 11-year-old Chris recalls back to looking for something beneath his bed while in Missy's office, indicating that his mother has not yet arrived home. Chris feels conflicted about asking for assistance and communicates his anxiety and hesitation. The scenario begins with a flashback to 11-year-old Chris, who feels tense and guilty as he hacks into the wood on his bed and chats to Missy on the phone. In the present, Chris, now an adult, sits in Missy's office, filled with emotion and unable to move. Main character wakes up from a nightmare about the sunken place to find a note from his buddy Rod. As he explores the Armitage property, he snaps photographs of nature and Georgina, noting her uncanny awareness of his presence. Chris attempts to make small chat with Walter, but his aloof and evasive manner generates tension. Chris is feeling restless and unclear about his status in the Armitage family. Chris enters Rose's bedroom and expresses his concern that Rose's mother brainwashed him, resulting in odd nightmares and aversion to smokes. They discuss Chris's fears about Walter's antagonism, and Rose offers to speak with her father. Chris and Rose attend a party in the garden with around visitors and one Japanese guy. Chris meets Gordon and Emily Green, an elderly man and his wife. Chris and Rose converse with a number of party attendees, including Nelson Dietz and his wife Lisa, who make a run at Chris and inquire about his love life. Chris snaps photos and notices Dean pointing him out to several couples. He also notices another black man during the gathering. The situation begins lightheartedly, but turns heated when Parker makes provocative views about race, then awkward when Lisa makes a move at Chris. Chris attempts small talk with Armitage family friend Andre during their gathering. Chris feels disappointed by Andre's indifference. Rich Philomena interrupts to introduce herself to Chris. The main conflict in the Armitage garden is Chris's disappointment that Andre isn't who he expected. Chris approaches a guy alone near the gazebo as Dean toasts a new age. In the gazebo, Chris and Jim talk, setting a quiet, optimistic tone. Chris goes to Rose's room to charge his phone, but it's disconnected and dead. He thinks Georgina unplugged it, which Rose doubts. Chris's anxiety and Rose's distrust make the Armitage family scenario uncomfortable and suspicious. Chris calls Rod from Rose's childhood room and tells Rose's mother he's hypnotized. Rod's unease with the White family causes tension. Georgina, the maid, appears, apologizes for touching Chris's possessions, and initiates an awkward discussion, making Chris feel uncomfortable. Chris meets numerous pals who appear to share a secret joke in Dean's garden. Chris is uneasy when Dean asks about being African American. Chris gives Andre/Logan the questions, snaps a photo, and unwittingly turns him angry. Photo and Andre/Logan morphs. Dean says Chris' phone flash caused Rose and Chris horrific seizure. Andre/Logan apologizes and departs with Missy and Philomena. They play bingo and fireworks to brighten the atmosphere. Rose and Chris' quarrel continues as Chris leaves her on a stroll. The midday living room scenario is tight and awkward with flashes of levity. In the woods, Rose and Chris discuss Chris's perplexity and discomfort, especially his feeling that he knew Logan, the guy who abducted him earlier. Dean and other partygoers auction a Chris photo in the garden. Rose attempts to encourage Chris to talk about his thoughts, but he closes down, increasing tension and confusion. Dean sells a property to Jim Hudson in the backyard as Chris and Rose talk in the woods. Chris's pain from his mother's death is triggered when Rose says she's late for her period. However, they comfort each other and return home. A competitive bidding and a serious, private talk between Chris and Rose make the situation emotionally weighty. Chris washes up after Chris and Rose get home from their party. He sends Rod a photo of Logan/Andre dressed differently and with an older white lady. Rod sees Logan/Andre's link to Teresa's sister Veronica. A dead battery cuts the discussion, leaving Chris Logan/Andre inquiries unanswered. Chris is preparing to leave Rose's bedroom at night when he finds a photo book of Rose with black boys, including Walter, in her closet. This finding makes Chris doubt Rose's commitment and trust. Chris explains everything in the vehicle after discovering the record, leaving Rose uninformed. The issue remains unsolved as Chris leaves the room. Dean led Rose, Jeremy, and Missy stop Chris from leaving the home to take his ailing dog to the doctor in this tense and unsettling scenario. Chris is asked about his purpose and objectives, and as he tries to escape, the world blurs and he collapses. The scene is a house's entryway and living room at night, with a raging fireplace and painting over it. Jeremy and Dean treat Chris's head injuries in his living room after he falls down a dark abyss. He calls for Rose, who murmurs before taking him to a dark, deserted basement. Chris ignites a lighter alone and sees a gigantic antlered beast. Sid is Chris's dog when Rod visits his flat. Rod is worried when he finds an Andre Hayworth missing person story on Chris's laptop after feeding Sid. Chris awakens strapped to a chair in a dark room with taxidermized animals and speaks to his abductor via TV before falling asleep. Rod and Chris express their anxiety and terror in different areas of Chris's residence. In this dramatic police station scenario, TSA agent Rod Williams reports his pal Chris missing to Detective Latoya. Rod thinks a rich family kidnapped and indoctrinated Chris into sex slavery. He gives Detective Latoya a picture of Chris' buddy Andre, who disappeared and returned as a new person. Although initially skeptical, Detective Latoya contacts Garcia and Drake to hear Rod's account, showing she is listening. Detectives Garcia and Drake dismiss Rod's hypnosis and White Girl worries at the station. Rose's family is accused by Rod, who tapes their chat. Rod attempts to talk to Rose about Chris' absence in Rose's dining room, but Rose accuses Rod of having affections for her, forcing him to hang up in terror. Rose stares blankly at her family as the scene concludes. Chris, remaining in the games room, wakes up to Dean's father Roman Armitage's television speech. Roman convinces Chris to accept the Armitage family's medical breakthrough, the coagula operation. Roman and his family wave to the camera as behold the coagula appears on the screen after the sequence shows the Armitage estate at sunset. Roman uses music and a lovely location to relax Chris while hinting at the broader tension of Chris's imprisonment and the coagula treatment. In a stressful and Chris slowly grasps the process, asking questions and making remarks, then falls consciousness again, setting up the operating room scenario. A bocce ball from Chris hits Jeremy in the games room. Chris stabs Dean with deer antlers in the operating room, and someone saws off Jim's head. Chris ignites the operation room. Georgina sees Chris's reflection in the kitchen and flees. Missy and Chris fight at her workplace, leaving Chris with a bloody letter opener. As arguments persist and emotions rise, the scenario finishes with a feeling of danger and violence. Chris battles Jeremy in the foyer of the Armitage mansion before stabbing him in the leg and speeding away in a sports vehicle. In his attempt to flee, Chris accidentally strikes Georgina with his vehicle and is stunned to find her death. The scenario concludes with Chris halting his vehicle and taking in the tragedy of what has just happened. Young Chris, frightened, drives away from the Armitage home with Georgina, who changes into his grandmother. A gun-wielding Rose fires at him, but he flees. Walter, revealed to be Roman Armitage, pursues and assaults Chris, resulting in Walter's suicide. Chris almost chokes Rose to death before stopping. They drive away, leaving Rose and Rod behind, and the scenario ends in sorrow and violence.